Hello everyone, good morning. Welcome to our Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Erin. I'm joining you today from the Aquarium of the Pacific, and I'm very excited to get to chat with all of you today. We're going to be exploring our local kelp forests. So that's what we're looking at right here. Now, throughout our program, if you have any questions or if you have any observations you'd like to share, we're going to do our best to answer those questions live on the air. Amanda's going to put a number up. Perfect. Here we go. If you have any questions at all, you can text us here at 562-286-1838. And we can answer those questions live this morning. Now, if you're watching this on a different day, today is Friday. If you're watching this on a different day, then you can email us at live@lbaop.org, and we'll do our best to get back to you within the next couple of days. So we're going to be exploring our local kelp forest today. So I want you to imagine that you're here in Southern California and you're out snorkeling in our kelp forest. You're floating on top of the water, you're looking down, and this is what you're seeing. So what do you notice? What types of observations can you share? If you have any observations, go ahead and text us here at this number. We'd love to hear what you see. In the meantime, I'm going to make some observations myself. So I'm seeing a couple of different things. One thing, I'm seeing these long strands of kind of greenish golden kelp. Maybe you've seen that before washed up on the beach, but this is what it looks like when it's underwater. What else? I see a couple of really, really large fish. These are our giant sea bass. They're swimming through the exhibit. What else do we see? I notice that there are rocks in this habitat, and it looks to me like there are rocks, and then the kelp is anchored into those rocks. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. I'm seeing that there are a lot of smaller fish in this exhibit as well. So we saw those large fish, but there are also several smaller fish. I notice also that it looks like there's maybe sandy bottom in between the rocks. So there are some rocks. Look at this very large school of fish. Any other observations, any other things that you notice about our kelp forest? Now, this particular view that we're looking at is our Blue Cavern exhibit. Blue Cavern is one of our exhibits here at the aquarium. It's our largest kelp forest exhibit. It's about 3 stories tall, and it allows us to see what a kelp forest looks like. Now, I think we might have some videos of kelp forest out in the ocean that we can check out as well. But take a look. What do you notice about this kelp forest? I see that there's a lot of water movement. You notice that water movement, how it's kind of causing the kelp to sway in the water? I also notice that it looks like the kelp is sitting on the surface. So what happens is the kelp grows really, really fast, and it grows taller than the water is deep, and it ends up creating this layer called the canopy. So just like in a rainforest, you might have a canopy. This is the canopy of the kelp forest. Now, it looks like also we're seeing a lot of shadows, and then we're seeing some bright kind of streams of light coming through. So that might impact some of the animals that live in the kelp forest. And I notice also, look at how many different strands of kelp there are throughout this kelp forest. So just like we have forests on land, we also have forests underwater. And this is an example of one of those forests, these kelp forests. And just like the forests on land are made up of trees, the kelp forests are made up of these strands of kelp, with the main difference being that kelp is actually an algae, it's not a plant. Now, I want to take a second and think about why kelp is important. Why is it that we need kelp? Why is it that kelp is beneficial for us on land? Why is it beneficial for the animals in the ocean? So if you have any ideas about why kelp is important, go ahead and text us right here. We'd love to hear your answers. But why is it that you think that kelp is important? Now, first off, you can see by looking at this, it's a home, right? It's a critical home for the animals that live in it. And one thing that we'll see about this kelp being a home is that it actually is divided up into different regions. So just like there are animals in a rainforest that you might expect to find up in the trees versus animals in the rainforest you might expect to find down on the ground, the same thing happens in a kelp forest. So the top area we just talked about, that's called the canopy. What types of animals would you expect to find in the canopy? That's that very top section, right, where the kelp kind of covers the surface. Any ideas? Right now, we're in the canopy. So this is a kind of a view from the canopy, from the very top of the kelp forest, although you can see there's much less kelp in this exhibit than there was in that ocean view. Now, one thing we'll see up in this canopy section is we often see very, very small fish. And of course, right as I say that, we have a visitor that doesn't usually live in the canopy is coming up to say hello. But in this top part, we have a lot of the small fish, often like the fish fry, the baby fish. And that's because they're able to hide in the canopy. In that section on the surface, they're able to hide and use that as shelter. The next area that we see is the midwater. That ends up being where we have a lot of our medium-sized fish. So we might see fish like perch or kelp bass, other types of fish you can see. Looks like we have yellowtail swimming through the midwater. So that ends up being an area with a lot of activity, a lot of movement, lots of fast-moving fish. Sea lions here in this midwater section swimming through. And then as we continue diving all the way down to the seafloor, then we get to kind of a different habitat. That habitat is called the holdfast. And a holdfast, I've got an example of one here. We can take a closer look a little bit later, but I'll just hold it so you can see it. This is a holdfast. It's almost like the root system of the kelp forest. So what happens is there's a long strand of kelp that attaches to this, and this holdfast will attach to a rock. So this is how the kelp stays attached to the rock. And often living in this holdfast, you end up finding lots of small animals. So things like sea stars and brittle stars, small crabs, small snails. So we have a lot of invertebrates that live in this area. And you can imagine if you have invertebrates living in this area, you probably also have animals that like to eat those invertebrates. So one common resident of the holdfast are leopard sharks. We'll see if we can find a leopard shark for you to look at. This is an example of a leopard shark. One thing that you'll notice is that this is a really long and slender shark. So they do reach up to about 6 feet long, but look at how narrow they are. This shark is not going to be an especially fast shark. And you'll see that its mouth is located on the bottom of its face, which is perfect for eating animals that live on the ground in the kelp forest. So this shark is really, really well adapted for living in that kelp forest habitat. What do you notice about the patterns on the shark? What sorts of observations can we make about the patterns along the back of the shark? It has these like spots or stripes kind of on them. And the purpose of that, remember we saw that swaying kelp and we saw the light coming through and the shadows that it created. These spots help the shark to blend in with all those shadows from the kelp. So this shark is really, really well adapted for living in the holdfast, that very bottom section of the kelp forest. Now let's take a look at another resident of the holdfast section of the kelp forest, and that's our giant sea bass. Now the first thing you'll probably notice is that it has a similar pattern. So it has spots just like that leopard shark had, again for blending in with the kelp forest, those shadows. Another thing you'll see is look at this mouth. It has a very, very large mouth. And the purpose of that large mouth is that basically what this fish does is it hides. So it uses that pattern to hide in the kelp forest. And then when fish swim by, it opens up its mouth really, really big. And that opening movement causes all the water in front of the fish to go into their mouth. So it basically sucks in all of the water and then any fish that are swimming around in there as well. So it's a really, really great way for this fish to be able to grab onto their food. So again, like I said, this is another common resident. Another one that we'll see often in the holdfast is our Nori Eels. And Nori Eels that actually spend their time in the rocks and the cracks and the crevices of the rocks. They're often homes, or roommates I should say, to lobsters. So they'll share the same cracks and crevices that the lobsters live in. So they'll spend their time in those rocks. So that holdfast section you can see ends up being an entirely different habitat to the canopy of the kelp forest. So we don't see lobsters in the canopy. We don't see that many leopard sharks in the canopy. So it ends up being a really different habitat. Just like forests on land have different habitats, depending on where you look vertically, the same thing is true for kelp forests. So we talked about how this is a really important habitat for our animals. It's also important for their protection. So that's the reason that they use it as a habitat. There's a lot of great hiding spaces in here. There's a lot of food sources as well. So if you remove the kelp from this habitat, then we end up having that loss of that protection, a loss of a safe place for the babies, those fry to live in the canopy. We also lose the loss of a food source. So lots of animals will feed on the kelp, or they'll feed on the animals that live in the kelp forest. So that's why the kelp is really important for the animals. Now, as far as us on land, the kelp is an important source of oxygen. So kelp, like other algae, performs photosynthesis, and that's how we get some of our oxygen that we breathe. Now, most of the oxygen that we breathe on land that comes from the ocean will come from microscopic algae, so they're not going to come from these really, really large algae, but they are one of the sources. So that is one of the sources. Now, this is another resident of our kelp forest. This is a California sheephead. This one's actually a male, and I can tell because it has this pink section in the middle and this large hump on its head, and then that distinctive white chin as well. Here you can see the female sheephead. All California sheephead will start their lives out as female, and then when there's no longer a male in the population, the most dominant female will transition into a male. So that's one of their ways of controlling their population, basically. So we've talked about some of the reasons that kelp is important. We've talked about some of the residents of a kelp forest. Now, I want to talk about some of the challenges. What are some of the challenges that kelp forests face? Any ideas? Now, for those of you in Southern California, your first thought might be that there's tons of kelp forests outside of LA County. There's lots of people in LA. There must be some issues with pollution, and that's exactly right. So pollution, whether it's chemicals and dirty water that's reaching our oceans, or whether it's actual plastic trash pollution, definitely has an impact on our kelp forests. But there are several other impacts on our kelp forests as well. One of them is overfishing. Any idea what that means, overfishing? Now, if we look at that word, overfishing is when you're removing animals from a habitat at a rate that's faster than they're able to replace themselves. So what we end up seeing is people fishing for the animals that live in the kelp forest, and those animals aren't able to replace themselves. And we'll talk a little bit in a second about one of the solutions that the aquarium is working on to help with this overfishing issue. But something that we can do to help is by supporting marine protected areas. So just like there are parks on land, there are also parks in the ocean, and those marine parks are really important for the animals that live there. They provide a safe place for animals to be able to reproduce, and they help us to basically protect our local habitats. And that can mean that maybe those animals are protected within that area, and then they might leave the area, and at that point they can be fished. So it can help our local fisheries in order to have these protected areas that can then spill over into the rest of our fishing areas that are found locally. Another big issue that kelp forests face is climate change. So as our climate is changing, as we release more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we're creating this blanket around the Earth. And as that blanket gets thicker and thicker and thicker, our oceans are getting warmer and warmer. And the issue with that is that the kelp is really sensitive to those temperature changes. So sometimes during the summer, we'll even see just a couple of days where the temperature of our oceans gets above 70 degrees, and even that short amount of time can be really devastating to our local kelp forests. And like we talked about earlier, as soon as you remove that kelp from the habitat, you end up having all of these issues with the animals that depend on it, because then they won't be able to survive without having that protection, without having that food source, without having the other animals that depend on it. So it ends up being really detrimental to the animals that live there and to the kelp forests. Now, I want to talk about some of the conservation efforts that the Aquarium of the Pacific is doing in order to protect our kelp forests and the animals that live in them. The first one I want to talk about is our giant sea bass. So you might have, you remember we talked about our giant sea bass a little bit earlier. That's this fish that you can see here. Now this fish, one thing that you can't really tell from this picture is the massive size of this fish. Giant sea bass can reach up to 500 pounds. So you can imagine in the 1900s, they were seen as a really, really great catch. From what I've heard, they also taste pretty delicious. They are pretty but not scared of people, so they're kind of these gentle giants that would just cruise right up to spearfishers, and they were caught by both spearfishers and people fishing from boats. And so they were overfished almost to the point of extinction. So we almost reached this point where this really, really cool, really large fish wasn't able to be seen here in California. The state of California has since protected the giant sea bass, and their numbers are slowly coming back. So we're slowly starting to hear more and more people seeing giant sea bass while they're out in our local waters. Now you might be wondering, but what is the aquarium doing to help it? The aquarium is working to reproduce giant sea bass. We actually had a really great success story of a giant sea bass that was born here, or hatched here at the aquarium. Its name is Utaka. It's now 6 or 7 years old, I think. And that was the very first giant sea bass to hatch in a public aquarium, which is pretty cool to see. This is Utaka as a baby. You can see that he looks very different than the adult version. Still has those spots, but a very different fin shape and a different body shape as well. Now, as Utaka grew and grew and grew, he started to look a little bit more like our other giant sea bass. And Utaka is on exhibit to be able to be seen. Now, you might be thinking, well, what's the challenge? Why weren't other people able to reproduce this? Now, the challenge is that giant sea bass spawn by releasing their eggs and their sperm into the water. And then the eggs will get fertilized and they float in the water, which is really great when they're in a kelp forest, because then they can kind of float around, the eggs will hatch. Here, look at how cute this one. I love this photo. That's Utaka. The eggs will hatch in the canopy, and the baby fish will be able to grow in the canopy. The problem is that in an aquarium, when they release their eggs and their sperm, we have special filters that are designed to pick up things in the water. So the filters can pick up those eggs, and so it can be really difficult. So we were able to capture those eggs before they got picked up in the filter, and we were able to raise them behind the scenes until we were able to get Utaka. Now, another project I want to talk about that also involves breeding animals here at the aquarium is our abalone breeding program. So has anyone ever heard of an abalone before? These are abalone. They are snails. They were also overfished, so they were fished for their meat, which is eaten, and then also for their shells. They have that really beautiful shell. I've actually got one here. Let me show you what it looks like. This is what the inside of the shell looks like. It has this really beautiful coloration on it. So they were fished for things like decorations and jewelry, and they were fished to the point where they were really, really rare to find here. In fact, 2 abalone species, the white abalone and the black abalone, were the first 2 invertebrates, so animals without a backbone. They're the first 2 invertebrates to be added to the endangered species list. So you can imagine then reproducing animals like white abalone. That's, the equivalent of reproducing animals like rhinos or other endangered species. It's just happening in an aquarium with animals that live in an aquarium. So what we've been able to do is we worked with the state of California and a couple of other aquariums and marine labs around the state to be able to work on our technique. So we practice with the red abalone, which is the most common abalone here in Southern California. It is not an endangered species, but it allowed us to work on our technique, develop the processes and the procedures. And I should say this project has been going on for over a decade. So this is a project that we've been working on for a very long time. And the first stage of that was doing this research. So we were able to develop the techniques for how to reproduce them in an aquarium setting. The next stage of that was applying that technique to white abalone. So we were able to, here you can see this is a tiny larval abalone. Abalone have a similar part of their life cycle to the giant sea bass in the fact that they are also broadcast spawners. So they release their eggs and their sperm into the water. So we need a way to catch those eggs and those sperm, allow them to fertilize, and then raise them while they're plankton. So while their animals are just kind of float in the water, we raise them through that plankton stage until they develop that shell that you just saw. And it's okay, that shell that you just saw in that last photo. And when they get that shell, they get heavy and they kind of settle out of the water and they start to live on rocks. And then they look like just like teeny tiny abalone. They look just like this, but much, much smaller. And then they'll grow and they'll grow and they'll grow and they'll grow until they're full size after around like 7 or 10 years. So you can imagine this is a long-term project. So after the aquarium was successful in breeding red abalone, we tried it with white abalone, which is that endangered species. We were able to reproduce the white abalone, and then we worked on a project where we basically were, it's called outplanting, which basically means that we're releasing them out into the ocean. Now that has to be done really strategically, because does this look like a fast-moving animal? No. Does this look like an animal that's going to travel really long distances in order to find a mate? Definitely not. So we needed to make sure that we were finding ideal habitats for them to reproduce. We were finding habitats where there are other abalone for them to reproduce with, and we were putting them out there in a way that they would be safe and they wouldn't be preyed upon right when we put them out. So our team would go out and they would study our local rocky reef areas, so our local habitats, and they would study where it is that the abalone is spending their time, where those habitats are, and that helped us in releasing them. Now that information for where they were released is top secret because we want to make sure they're not fished out of the ocean, so that's information that's not shared at all. And when they are released, we release them in these, they're almost like little abalone cages. And the way these cages work is we stuff them full of kelp, which is their food, and we put the abalone inside of there, and we lower it down to the seafloor in that perfect, ideal, top secret habitat. And once it's in there, the abalone will typically spend a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks in there, and then they'll eventually leave that abalone cage. So they have the ability to exit the cage, but predators can't enter it. So it helps to keep them safe while letting them kind of acclimate to their new habitat before they leave it, and will eventually find some sort of rocky habitat to live on. So that's a project, like I said, that we're doing with the state of California that is helping to reproduce and repopulate a local endangered species, which is pretty exciting work for us to be involved with. The very last Kelp Forest conservation project I want to talk about is definitely the cutest Kelp Forest conservation project. And you'll be thinking, well, these snails are not very cute. I think they're cute, but even cuter are these sea otters. The Aquarium of the Pacific is involved in a sea otter again, a rescue and rehabilitation program. So we've partnered with the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and we are still in the stages of developing this project. But our goal is to be able to have our sea otters here at the aquarium serve as surrogate mothers. So this is something that the Monterey Bay Aquarium has been doing for many, many years. And as you can imagine, it requires a lot of people power. It requires a lot of space. It requires a lot of equipment. So the Aquarium of the Pacific is getting involved in it to help as well. So every single year, there are dozens of baby sea otters that find themselves stranded on the coast of Central California. And without their mother, they have no way of finding their food or of grooming or of growing and developing. So what we're doing is we're going to be matching these baby sea otters up with mother sea otters, and the mother sea otters will teach them how to find their food, how to groom, how to swim, how to do all of these different things. And then eventually, once the baby sea otters have gotten bigger, they've learned those skills, they've graduated from Sea Otter 101, then they will get a chance to be released out into the ocean where they will live for the rest of their lives, which is really exciting. We're really excited to be involved. We're currently in the stage of building up our infrastructure for it, and here you can see we also have a couple of babies, not this small, but we do have a couple of babies that are working with our mother sea otters right now as kind of practice babies. So these babies are not releasable. They'll live the rest of their lives at an aquarium, but it's a chance for our mother sea otters to practice what it's like because they've never been mothers themselves. So it's their chance to practice, develop those mother skills so that they can eventually teach a baby sea otter how to survive in the ocean. Do you know which one this is? This is one of our sea otters that we had as a baby. So in the past, we've accepted rescues. So when sea otters are rescued and they have to have too much human care, then they're not able to be released just because they've had too much of that one-on-one human interaction. It wouldn't be safe to release them out into the ocean. So in the past, those non-releasable sea otters have come to the aquarium and we've been able to raise them. The difference here with this project is that those babies, instead of being raised by our aquarium staff, will be raised by our sea otters so that they are releasable after their time with our sea otters. That was Ollie that we just saw. That was our sea otter Ollie as a baby. So again, if anyone has any questions here, I want you to reach out to us at this number. We have a couple minutes. If you've got any questions, we'd love to answer those. But I want to just take a second to think back to our kelp forest and the things that we've talked about today. So today we learned about the importance of a kelp forest, what the importance is as a habitat, what the importance is for the animals. One thing we didn't touch upon as much is the importance for the people that live here in Southern California. So these kelp forests are really unique habitats. They exist only in a couple of places around the world, and just like people travel to the Great Barrier Reef or Indonesia to scuba dive, people also travel here to Southern California to scuba dive in our kelp forests. So it ends up being an important area for recreation, an important area for fishing and kayaking and stand-up paddleboarding and scuba diving and snorkeling and glass-bottom boats and whatever it might be. That it's an important area for the people that live here, and it's obviously an important habitat for our animals. And they are threatened, so it's important that we do our part, especially for those of us living here in Southern California, that we do our part to protect our local kelp forest habitats and the animals that live in them and depend upon them. Here at the aquarium, we're doing what we can to help protect them. We love being able to do these conservation projects with our local habitats and our local species, which is pretty exciting to be involved. And I want to thank all of you for joining me today. Aquarium Online Academy will be back on Monday with another program, so be sure to tune in Monday at 9 a.m. And for any of our Spanish viewers, I want to remind you we do have programs on Wednesdays. Every Wednesday we offer a Spanish program. So we hope to see you soon at one of our next Aquarium Online Academies. Thank you.